there is a surface similarity, or simplicity, a surface simplicity to the book of Ruth. You read through it, it's a wonderful story. It's beautiful. It sort of moves, and we see some people, they're good people, good things happen, and we walk away thinking that was good. But we saw last week that there's actually a lot more going on beneath the surface. There are layers to the book of Ruth. And we talked about this issue, well, we didn't, I did to you, about this idea of a story within a story within a story. We sort of likened it to the movie Inception, the dream within a dream and all that. The story we have in front of us, we got Ruth, Boaz, Naomi, but it's also set within a story. We know that because the very last word of the book of Ruth is the word David. It ends with the genealogy of David. So it's leading us to David to think about the kingship of David. But then we also talked about, it's not just David, what's after Ruth, but what's before Ruth in terms of Abraham. The Abrahamic covenant beginning in Genesis chapter 12. That I'm calling you, Abraham, to be a blessing to the nations, that even Gentiles will come in. And so we see Ruth as a Gentile, a Moabitess, she's repeatedly called that in the book, coming into the community of faith. Then the larger story, we have the story within the story, but the story within the story within the story, the larger story of Jesus Christ. Because David takes us and points us to Jesus Christ. And we've talked about how even in the Gospel of Matthew, in the genealogy, Ruth is mentioned very particularly, and Abraham and David are mentioned in Matthew 1:1. So that's all of that, the story within the story within the story. We saw two confessions last week. We saw Ruth's radical confession of allegiance to the living God. She leaves her people, leaves those gods, and comes to seek the living God with Naomi. And Naomi's confession of her lament, which was infused with the sovereignty of God. Here is a God who is sovereign even in the midst of pain. And that's where we ended sort of last week. Today is the structure of the sermon, just so you know where I'm going, or sort of more importantly, how I'm going, is I want to actually work from the edges of our text into the middle and then into the very center. So those will be my three moves. We're going to start at the very edges of the text. Matter of fact, let's start at actually the end of chapter 2. I want you to look at the end of chapter 1, end of chapter 1, verse 23, and then we're going to look at the very end of chapter 2. And notice the similarities, and we'll talk about the differences. Chapter 1, verse 22. So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Last verse in chapter 2. So she, that's Ruth, stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law, who is Naomi. Same people, Ruth and Naomi, they're together, same time frame, sort of the harvest, and we know I think that's intentional by the author, but something's changed within the space of this chapter 2, right? At the end of chapter 1, Naomi was in this place of bitterness. Don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant in Hebrew. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because God's hand's been hard upon me. But now, at the very end of chapter 2, as we read, that she is now praising God. She's thanking God because there's been somebody that's taken notice of them. And so something's happened in the space of this chapter that I think is important. And so Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 sets this up. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And he is, in many ways, the main mover character of chapter 2 for us. Verse 2, when Ruth the Moabitess said it to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of the grain after one in whose sight I may find favor. Sort of a scene shift. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. So we've got these two people. We've got Ruth going out, almost like the split screen if we were doing a movie. We got the backstory here is, hey, here's Boaz. Here's how he's related. And then you got Ruth who doesn't know about Boaz. We got to somehow, as we're the readers of the story, if you know the story, we got to connect them together somehow. And verse 3 does that. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz. Any Israelite reader, and I think as Christian readers, we ought to look at anytime we see that word, well, she happened. It wasn't like, hey, what a lucky coincidence, right? No, God's active behind the scenes. God is sovereign in his providence. He is guiding the story. Even when he's not mentioned, she happened. Every commentator reading this, they stop at that phrase, she happened, and there's always a wink. It's like nothing just happens in the biblical story. Nothing just happens in your life. God is active in it. Providence is the great doctrine that's under discussion here. At least, it's not under discussion, it's rather being illustrated for us. Children were often catechized in the Christian faith in the Reformation tradition using the Westminster Shorter Catechism. This is for children. So they asked question 11, what are God's works of providence? And the answer given was, God's works of providence are his most holy, wise, and powerful, preserving and governing all his creatures and all their actions. All their actions. And this is the providence manifested in the ordinariness of life. As I'm reflecting upon the book, what has been the most amazing to me in reading this and studying and getting prepared for these sermons was just the ordinariness of life in the book. It's just ordinary. It's almost boring. I mean, there's no fire from heaven. There's no splitting of the Red Sea. There's no burning bush. There's no food from heaven called manna. You got to actually go out. You got to go work. You got to bend over, pick up sheaves, beat it out, get the grain, make bread. It's just ordinary stuff. There's no prophets. There's no priests. There's no kings. There's no judges even. There's no mighty men doing mighty things. It's just ordinary. One author said this about the whole book. It deals with unimportant people and unimportant matters. People get hungry. They got to move. Some of you are having to move. People die. People get married. They have a baby. There's the book, right? You're like, that's sort of ordinary. That's, what is that? What's that mean for us? I think it's helpful to recognize those things that aren't there as well as what's there. God is active even in the ordinariness of life. We forget that. Which means that we can trust God to lead and guide even when it seems boring. It seems like nothing's happening. Day after day and week after week. God's not just found in the big details or the miraculous or the big stuff, but in the day-to-day, the ordinary. He's operative in these small details. This would be important, I think, for some of you graduates to hear this. Because I get it. Sometimes you have those speeches at your graduation ceremony. You will be the generation that changes the world. You probably won't. I mean, that's why I'm not invited to those things. It's like, don't. Who brought him? I had one of those Ecclesiastes moments a number of years ago. I forget when it was. You get to a certain age, you begin to realize, I'm going to die. So you can tell what kind of mood I was in that day. I'm going to die someday. And the world is probably going to continue to go on pretty much the same as it is. Republicans will be fighting Democrats. The same stuff will be happening over and over again. And my contribution, at least from the human perspective, will eventually fade. My memory will fade. Maybe my great-grandchildren. But after that, just a guy in a picture. That's for most of us. That's what it'll be like. And that's okay. And that's okay. That's the wisdom of Ecclesiastes. Your life, especially if you're young graduates, your life should be characterized by faithfulness, not greatness. And your life will be probably boring. It will look boring. Matter of fact, faithfulness often looks boring. Ask a mother with a newborn. Day after day, I'm changing the diaper. I'm doing things, giving my life, my energies. This being is keeping me up. And they will not remember any of it. To say thank you, they won't. When I first had my first child, I loved him so much. I couldn't believe how much love I had. I remember I was in the kitchen of our apartment. I'm rolling those little donut things off the little thing, and he's just in the little thing. He's just happy. He's doing it. I'm so happy to make my son happy. And I'm thinking to myself in this moment, he will never remember this. I'll remember it the rest of my life. He will never remember this even happened. And then maybe start thinking about my mom. How much did she do for me? So I wrote this wonderful card on Mother's Day. And my mom later told me, she says, after every one of her children had their first child, she got the best Mother's Day cards ever. You're like, you did this? Faithfulness looks boring. But here's the good news. Our great and cosmic King who reigns over all nations, as we heard in the prayer, he tells us that even if you give a cup of water in my name to a child, he doesn't forget it. He doesn't forget it. God is providence. He is leading in the small things. But it doesn't negate human actions. So the book is not giving us a treatise on providence or sovereignty, but is demonstrating it, and it shows that human decisions, because human decisions are pushing us forward. Ruth got up and didn't say, God, what should I do? I'm sure she did pray. We don't have it listed, but there was no light from heaven. She's, I got to go find work. And so she does. And she just so happens to come to the field of Boaz. And so providence works in and through human actions and characters. We're going to see that. Now, I get it. There's some deep theology here when you start actually trying to probe into how is it that God is completely sovereign? What about human responsibility? This thing sometimes people call free will. You know, where's all this play? And I was thinking about the analogy of light. Light, light. Sunlight, just light. It's a basic fact of our existence. We live and move, and we sort of have this, our being in light. We need it to exist. Now, some people have a specialized interest in light. They say, I wonder what it is. What is this thing called light? And so scientists, they're like, what are the theoretical foundations of this? And I know some of you are thinking, I just got out of school. Why is he going to talk? He's not going to talk science, is he? Just a little. But scientists recognize that light functions sort of like both a particle and a wave. Sort of doing this. I'm getting some nods, like some people know what I'm talking about. And this was counterintuitive because it's not supposed to be both. Well, which one is it? Which one's more fundamental? And depending on what experiments you do, it has this duality to it. And most people think, I don't care, right? That's it. I'm glad you're thinking about that, but I just want light. I need light because light illumines a lot of stuff. That's its function. So if we look at light, it's difficult to figure out. It does counterintuitive things. But if we look through light, or with light, a great deal is illuminated. I think the doctrine of providence is the same way. If you start looking at it, and I think we should look at it, there's some things to think about theologically and philosophically, and occasionally I try to do some of that stuff. But sometimes people say, I can't figure that out. My brain just... But if we look through God's providence, which is what the characters here are doing, they're looking through God's providence as the lens, it illuminates a lot. It contextualizes pain. We saw that with Naomi. God's sovereign. She didn't say, well, I don't know what's happening. God must be out of control. No, God's somehow behind this. It contextualizes pain, and it gives hope. So I get there's some deep things there, but I think, again, if we'll look through providence, it'll help us. The middle section, look at verses 4 through 10. We heard these read already. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you. And we want to say, and also with you. But they say, may the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? He notices Ruth. Servant says, hey, this is the young Moabite. She came, with Naomi. She wanted to gather, verse 7. So she's been working hard. She's only taken a few breaks. She's only been in the house a little while. She's a hard worker. Verse 8. Now watch what Boaz says. What we're going to be experiencing now is the character of Boaz. Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. And she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? What is Boaz doing? He's manifesting his character by what he says and what he does, but what exactly is he doing particularly? Well, he's allowing Ruth to glean in his field. This harkens back to some laws that are found in Torah, in the book of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy, about how Israel was supposed to provide for the poor and needy. And one of the texts we have is Leviticus 23:22. One of the laws given to Israel, when you reap of the harvest of your land, moreover, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor gather the gleaning of your harvest. You are to leave them for the needy and the alien. Why? I am the Lord your God. Because my character is one who gives. So you're not to go all the way to the edges. You're supposed to leave some, intentionally leave some for those without. And if you also drop some stuff, because you're picking up lots of sheaves and some drop out, leave them. Matter of fact, it's almost like they intentionally leave some. This is how the poor are going to be helped. One of the ways they'll be helped in your community. So if the poor simply go into a field and start doing that on their own, that's called stealing. And God said, don't steal. But you, as the owner of the field, you have to leave some. This is how we take care of the poor and needy in this agrarian culture. And so Boaz is keeping the law of God in a lawless time. That's instructive for us, right? He's keeping the law of God. He knows the law of God. I know what I'm supposed to do, and he's doing it. Boom. And that's good. But there's something even better that Boaz does, because he does more than meet the legal minimum. Sometimes people will look at Christianity's ethics, and they'll say, you people, all you do is you obey because you're afraid you're going to go to hell. That's not a very good motivation ethically. Right? This is the criticism. You know, I'm a better person because I just do things I want to help people. You do it because you're afraid of going to hell. You're not motivated by concern. And I think the idea here is that God's law gives us the floor, the minimum, but it also shows us the trajectory of his heart when he says, because I'm the Lord your God. And ultimately, God's going for the heart. Even, that's not just a New Testament thing. That's an Old Testament thing. So Jesus pulls his ethic from the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love Lord God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might. And so he goes above and beyond. Look at verses 14 through 16 to see this. We've seen this already. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers. And he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. And when she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servant, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves. Oh, not just the droppings, not just the edges, but you let her up with you. And do not insult her. And you shall purposely pull out first some grain from the bundles and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. She's allowed to do this. And so she gleaned in the field until evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned. This is exciting. I think when he says even among the sheaves, you know, he's going above and beyond the law. He's got the trajectory of his heart. Say, this is what God wants to do. Let me go further, because we're going to find out he knows who this woman is. He knows about her. And verse 14 is fascinating. I think we read past this a little quickly, and we've got to take into account sort of the ancient Israelite situation. When he says, hey, why don't you come here and eat with us? And she sat next to the reapers. Now, this is not just mere, dining instructions, like a control freak. You sit here, you sit here, you sit here. Right? No, it's an invitation. She's a foreigner. She knows it. They know it. Everybody knows it. You don't belong. And Boaz says, you belong. And if the boss tells you, no, she sits here, I don't think whether I like it or not. Boaz is the boss. It's his field. He says she's at the table. She's at the table. And I cannot help but think of another Israelite who said to people that were broken and sometimes called sinners, come to the table. I'll sit with you. And you sit with me. And there are people that did not like this. They thought this was horrid and disgusting. And in Luke 15:2, they used these words about him. This man receives sinners and eats with them. Speaking of Jesus. They said that in a sort of fit, like, this would be repulsive. We as Christians read that and we say, that's life. That's life, that he receives sinners and eats with them. We still say that because he still sits down with us at a table. He says, come to the table. Come to the table. Boaz is illustrating this. One author has said this about him. Boaz wants to introduce Ruth to Bethlehem society, starting with his own workers. He insists that Ruth be treated no differently from any other worker. And so he goes on to say what Boaz gives to Ruth is justice, a place. You're welcome. You're here. This is home. That's what our Savior does for us. You're home. You're home. Sometimes people ask me, we had our discussions in our community group, what should I be thinking about when I come to the table of the Lord? Well, Jesus is one, but besides, what should I be doing with my thinking? And sometimes people will bow their heads, and I get that, you're trying to commune with Jesus, but I'll sometimes say, and open your eyes. Watch the people running through or going through, because that's your family. Because the boss, let's call him the Lord, has said, if they're at my table, you have to accept him. You have to accept them. I do. Doesn't matter whether you like them, what you think about them, whether you're a different socioeconomic status, whether they're different race, and they're at my table, you have to accept them. So learn to love them. This is the family. He loves to put a bunch of crazy people in the same room and said, let's have a party. Let's dine. together. That's where human history is actually leading to. This great, crazy group of people from all ages, all walks of life, everything. And he is going to say, let's eat, let's have the wedding feast. And we get to do that, and we practice every week. What Boaz is doing, he's showing kindness and favor. Matter of fact, Ruth recognizes this. We saw it in verse 10. Why have I found favor in your sight? Verse 13, she says the same thing. I have found favor in your sight. You've comforted me. You've spoken kindly to me. Boaz is reflecting the character of Yahweh, the living God. His covenant kindness, this word hesed, that's sometimes translated as loving kindness, sometimes translated steadfast love, sometimes just translated kindness. Verse 20 actually has the word in the text when Naomi says, may he be blessed of the Lord who has not withdrawn his kindness, his hesed, from the living and the dead. Boaz has internalized the character of God. He's manifesting the character of God in his speech, his actions, and this is his character. And that's the same for us that we do in the new covenant. Think of John 3:16. No, not that John 3:16. The other John 3:16. 1 John 3:16. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. We look first because Christ loved us first. He initiates. That's the good news. 1 John talks about that as well. But because we've been loved, we love. That's the commandment. That's over and over and over again. You see that. This is my commandment I give to you, Jesus says. Love one another. Love like just as I've loved you. Just as the Father's loved me, I've loved you. And now you love your brothers just like I loved you and the Father loved me. It's all about love, biblical love. And so we take on the character of the God whom we worship. We're supposed to, ethically, over time. Now we come to the center section. We see Boaz's confession. In verse 11, Boaz replied to her when she had asked the question, why have I found favor? I'm a foreigner. He answers, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. I know the backstory. And how he describes it is fascinating. I think he must have seen in this. Leaving, father, mother, land, going to a land you don't know and a people you don't know. That's... If you think about the story within the story, I think Boaz is thinking of the story within the story of Abraham. That's what Abraham did. When God calls Abraham in Genesis 12:1, he says this, now the Lord said to Abram, before his name was changed, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And Abraham then is the paradigm of faith and trust and obedience, not perfection. We can read the rest of the story, but he is a paradigm of faith, trust, and obedience, and what we see in Ruth is the same thing. He uses that language. That's the story within the story. But there's the story within the story within the story, right, pointing to Jesus, and I thought of that language about leaving your father and mother. He also uses that language for us. Matthew 10:37, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Jesus is challenged to complete and utter allegiance to himself. He's not saying you need to hate your parents. He does use the language, but I think that if you know the idiom, it's like you need to love me. Because your parents can be your past, defining your identity by your past, your children by your future, but you find your identity in me. If you love that, your past, the future, you love these relationships even more than me, then somehow you're not worthy of the kingdom. The kingdom demands everything because of the king. Ruth has experienced that. Hopefully you have as well. But then in verse 12, we end with this. When Boaz prays, it's a prayer, blessing kind of thing, but he's appealing to God. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. It's a prayer to bless Ruth, and there's some play on words going on with reward and full, with the word shalom, with peace and fullness going on there. So you've come here, you've found peace, you found rest. And right after he says this, the next thing he does is invites her to the table, I think illustrating it. The Lord takes notice of her work. The Lord takes notice of our work. Hebrews 6:10 says this, for God is not unjust, so as to forget your work and the love which you've shown toward his name. How do you show love toward God's name? In this context, he says, in having ministered and in still ministering to the saints. You want to love God? You want to love His name according to this text? You minister in the church. You minister to His saints. That's one way. And God takes, He remembers, He sees, He knows, He delights in that. And see, I love how this phrase that Boaz uses, you come to the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Come to seek refuge. What Boaz is doing here, he's actually instructing Ruth about the nature of God. We might call this discipleship in one sense. Telling her, this is the God to whom you've come. He's a God of refuge. It's a place of peace. It's a place of security. And if you understand something about the ancient world with the gods, of the other nations, they're different than the God of Israel. The God of Israel tells us this story in Genesis. He says, I'm going to make a people, not because I need anything, but I'm going to make a people to love, and they can commune with me, and I'm going to call them in my image. They're like vice regents. Think about them like a prince and a princess to rule over domain. I'm going to give them. God's giving and giving and giving. I'm going to bless you. When I want to make something as close to me as I could possibly make them, He makes humans. Powerful thought. Think, wow, what an exalted thing to be a human being. And it is. The ancient world, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, talks about the gods in that context, the false gods, and they're like, they seem to be needy and lazy. They're talking about something, we're hungry. What are we going to do? So they make slave labor. They make humans so that you can now come and give us food. You're slaves because we're lazy, and we can't, I guess whatever you ask these Gilgamite, people that believe this thing, it's like, can't your God feed Himself? Does He need to be fed even? But that's their story. That's their origin story. So Boaz is telling her, you're not coming to that kind of God. Needy, like a slave. You're coming to find security and rest. He protects. He gives. And then He manifests that with His character. And so we end with this confession of Boaz. We end with the Lord. The greatness of who He is. But in one sense, the Lord's been the main character all the way through. He's manifesting who He is through Boaz's speech, his actions, his character. And so this becomes the challenge for us. I'll end with this. If the world looks at us, or looks at you as an individual, your life, your coworkers, your family, they look at you, would they see the character of the living God? That's what God's love is like? That's what God's forgiveness is like? That's what His holiness is like? Because they look at you? What if they looked at us as a group, as pella? The world out there does not have a great view of the church, right? What if they looked at us and said, that's how they love, that's how they give, that's what it's like to be holy, that's what their God must be like? What might it be as a witness to the world? That's the challenge before us. That's the God whom we serve. And again, we'll be coming to this table and be reminded of all those things coming together in this unique moment. Let's pray.